pleasure of spending a fair amount of time with the Occupy movement over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and I'm really moved by the efforts and suffering that you're undertaking to try to bring these issues out into the public domain. It is frankly nothing short of scandalous that our banking system is operating in the way it presently is. As per, forgive me plugging it, my paper, The Law of Opposites, published a month ago by the Adam Smith Institute, available on free download on their website, as pointed out in that paper with the great help of accounting experts such as Tim Bush. Our modern banks, particularly RBS and probably the other state-owned bank, Lloyds, are actually paying themselves compensation, ostensibly profit-based compensation, but out of losses. This is unacceptable. It should be stopped. Particularly, we understand RBS are announcing bonuses today, tomorrow, to be paid later this month. I now call upon the regulators, okay at short notice, to accept the invitation from Occupy to have a meeting today, tomorrow, the next day, and please explain to us whether they've even seen any accounts of RBS, because we as members of the public have not seen any accounts for the year to date. The accounts we have seen, the third quarter accounts for 2011, show a year-to-date operating loss of over £2 billion. This has apparently been compensated by some insane credit in response to a supposed fair valuing for the fall in the public price of RBS's own debt. Let's just pause to consider precisely what this means. So the market now believes the veracity of the points that Nobel MPs like Steve Baker and others have put out in May 2011. They believe that this bank is insolvent, and therefore the debt is trading below par, i.e. the market does not believe that RBS is capable of repaying the debt it owes to investors. But according to deeply flawed European IFRS accounting rules, which only apply to banks, and which RBS and other banks voluntarily adopted in 2005, we are now to be told that this collapse in RBS's debt value constitutes a profit. Please, FSA, stop this nonsense. Engage with Occupy. Put up anybody. We don't need to have Hector Sands. His number 2, 3, 4 or 5 will do. And I and others will come down. Cobden Partners has a team of experts that can help you understand these issues if you need any further technical input. We've tried for 8 or 9 years to talk to you. Now the guys is, let's get to the bottom of this and let's put these bonuses on hold. Let's not allow the cash to be dispersed. Let's not sit by and watch these Occupy members and other members of society suffering increased VAT, austerity cuts and so on and so forth, purely to fund stewards of loss-making banks which have no place in this society. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure as a Conservative MP to be here with you. I think one of the things which is very much underestimated by the public at large is just how much careful thought is going into these issues amongst the Occupy movement. And I've been particularly impressed by what Rich said. You know, it's a really important contribution that's being made to the debate based on sound theory, on the literature, and yes, on different political perspectives. And I'm very glad to be here with Maurice Glasman, this is to make sure that this is, you know, a cross-party contribution. But I'm very, very impressed by the quality of intellectual effort going into this, and I hope that I hope very much that the public will become increasingly aware of just how careful and thoughtful you are. Now, with that, I think the reason that I'm here, the thing that we share, is a sense of outrage at the injustice inherent in the current financial institutions that we have. Gordon's explained how he believes that through accounting rules, bonuses are being paid out of capital. I believe that of all the many ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today. It's what the Governor of the Bank of England said, and I think it was autumn 2009. But what is that way of organising banking? Fiat money, fractional reserve deposit taking, deposit insurance, central banking, limited liability. Taken together, these factors have created a banking system which is absolutely toxic. I've said to people earlier that the money supply trebled between 1997 and 2010 from £700 billion to £2.2 trillion. If you're going to increase the money supply at that rate, you are bound to create injustice, because the money always goes to someone first. It's bound to create asset bubbles, and it is bound to widen wealth inequality and cause people to question the justice of the social system, and they're right to question it. So here we are in a crazy situation, bonuses being paid in banks which have been bailed out. That in itself is an injustice. The whole system is set up in an unjust way, and I'm very glad that all of you are putting in so much effort to consider what's going on. I'll just make one final point. I've worked here in the FSA as a contractor, a software engineer on a contract. I've worked at the SEC, and I've worked at a couple of investment banks, including Lehman Brothers, in their last couple of years. And it wasn't my fault, honestly. But what I found is that when you sit down and ask people how their business works, because you need to write the software to carry it out, you find quite quickly that people know how to get through their day, but they often don't even know their own job sufficiently well to tell you how it works to write the software. And that caused me to question whether anybody really understood the entire way the banking system works, whether anybody understood the complete social context of the way banking works, and whether they understood its impacts on politics, society and economy. And that's why I co-founded the Cobden Centre and got involved with Gordon when he started Cobden Partners. We're trying desperately hard to promote social progress through honest money, free trade and peace. We want to see a better society, a more just society, and we think that the fundamental beginning to this is reforming a banking system which I'm afraid very, very few people properly understand.
For the first time, I think, Steve, we've got to say that the Conservative Party is talking about capitalism. That's quite an extraordinary achievement if you look at the last 30 years, and I think that you've got to take an enormous amount of credit. What's even more astonishing is that the Labour Party is talking about capitalism, and for that you've really got to take a great degree of credit. I just want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, to talk directly about the executive pay issue and the financial sector, is that Aristotle said that anybody outside of relationships was either a beast or a god. And I think that the financial sector has managed to be both. It's managed to be both completely beastly, holding the power over people, commodifying people's lives, taking away people's status, completely putting short-term interests above long-term relational commitments. It's also had complete discretion over the way that the country works in our working lives. If you look between 1997 and 2007, of the £1.4 trillion invested in the British economy, 81% was in financial products and mortgages. We've had a whole life built upon debt and a diminishment of work, of the honest relationships required at work. And I think that what you've done, you've been a herald of the beginning of how we actually start living together, how we start building a better world together. And I think it's just the way that it is, that there is far more common ground now between backbenchers on the Labour side and the Conservative side. So what I want to say is to give some credit to Ed Miliband's distinction between predatory and productive capital. I think this is an extremely important thing to do. Now, when he says that the financial sector is predatory, it's completely committed to the maximisation of return on short-term investment. It's hostile to the very nature of human life, which is to build stable relationships between people that can generate value, that can generate trust, that can generate, the generation of genuine value. So what we've had is a very false system where the maximisation of returns on investment has come before the generation of a genuine substantive economy. And this has led to the thing I talked to Gordon about earlier, the commodification of playing fields, of schools, where everything is priced within the financial system. And meanwhile, the money managers, the people who work here and all around us, have been outside of all relationships. No one's held them to account. And that's why I think it's absolutely vital that we have the representation of the workforce on the remuneration committee. So they've got to at least justify at some level So what do we learn about human nature? That if you're accountable to no one, you will cheat. If you're accountable to no one, you will lie, and you will be nice to yourself. We see this in the public sector, and we see this in the private sector. We have to build a balance of interests in everything, where we have to negotiate. And I just want to pay absolute tribute to Occupy for the maturity of your politics. You've taught us all a lesson. We've got the Corporation of London, which is the most ancient city in the most ancient democratic city in the world, which lies outside of all relationships. They've got all these money and they lobby for the financial sector, and yet they're a democratic city, and there is no one to hold them to account. And I think for the first time about 500 years, Occupy has made a very reasonable attempt to enter into a relationship and to say to a public authority, publish your assets. And I think it's really high time that the Corporation of London did negotiate with you and talk to you and publish your asset and allow you to get a warm night's sleep in a nice bed. I think that's the least you deserve.
I'd love any of the speakers, especially those involved in politics, to talk about the relevance of very efficient expenditure of political capital by the financial sector. We gather about 50%, maybe plus, donations to the Conservative Party are from the city. That seems to me highly relevant in terms of these outcomes, which we're understanding from so many angles are theoretically insane in terms of what economists are saying. I think the elephant in the room here is the question of how those theoretically insane outcomes have been pursued year after year as evidence of trickle-down economics has become, thinner and thinner on the ground, actually working.
I think most people operating in the system have some wrong-headed ideas about the way it works. I mean, I think monetarism is essentially mistaken about money and bank credit. But most of the people working in politics today think monetarism's a good idea. Now, when you start putting all these blocks together, what you find is, I think all of us, like Keynes pointed out, I quoted him twice in one morning, but what Keynes pointed out, the defunct philosophers of yesterday, however he phrased it, the defunct philosophers of yesterday are the ones who determine the course of our lives today. And actually, I think Keynes is the one who is mostly determining the course of events. So why do capitalists give to the Conservative Party? Well, the Conservative Party's always been the capitalist party. I don't think there's actually a conspiracy. I think it's more likely there's cock-up. I mean, my own view is that government should serve the general interest. It should serve the general interest, not any special interest. And I think that should be the starting point for any conversation. But unfortunately, it's never true. You go into the chamber today and we'll be discussing HS2 and you'll find people talking from the point of view of Birmingham and feeling that the North will get benefit from it. You'll hear people talking about the damage to the Chilterns, and I'm afraid very often the political conversation is about special interests. So if I was just to wrap up what I'm saying, I think we need to get more people involved in politics who believe that the political process must serve the general interest, and then the conversation is about how do you get politics to serve the general interest, rather than constantly, one way or another, taxing people and funneling it to this particular group or that.
I think we've got to develop a politics of the common good, which will recognise that there's interests and they have to negotiate a common interest between themselves. Just two or three small big points, but said quickly. The first one is to look at the Corporation of London, which is a territorial authority, which is a lobbyist for the financial sector. The fact that the Prime Minister speaks and gives an account of how the government is serving their interests every year at the Guildhall speech, and then the Chancellor does so at the Mansion House. But we don't know how much money they spend on lobbying. We do know that they support Demos and they support Tony Travers at the LSE and they support loads of different interests. But because we don't have their accounts, we view money as a power, and we believe that democracy is the way that you resist the domination of the financial power. So wish to see a very big strengthening of democracy. There is enormous creative work to be done on developing a new relational political economy that's based on the generation of value by cooperation and active engagement between people within a genuine market system that is not exclusively dominated by the short-term speculative asset bubbles of the financial sector. We've also got work to do in developing our ideas of the common good of a democratic economy and a civil economy, and I think that's the challenge of the years ahead. So.
I'd just like to come back to the statement made by David Cameron on Sunday. The impression in some quarters that by improving transparency in executive pay and addressing the remuneration committees, which are then the cronyism there, that somehow executive pay levels will be addressed. I think he's actually missed the point completely. The way that the pay committees will operate, even if there is true transparency and even if there is worker representation on those committees, is that they will simply say, what is a fair rate for this job? And they will look at the market rate and they will say, okay, we'll pay that. But that's doing nothing to address the fact that those market rates are way too high. And in fact, it leaves me worse than that, because what will happen is they'll say the pay rate for this job is 3 million, we need to pay 3.1 to get someone good, they'll pay 3.1. The next committee will come along and say, oh, the pay rate's now 3.1, we need to pay 3.2 to get someone good. And it will just ratchet up and up and up. And what David Cameron has suggested isn't going to address that at all. We need to have some way of measuring what is a fair salary by changing the metrics. I mean, one of the things that Andy Haldane suggested in he's the works at the Bank of England, is that pay should be linked to return on assets, not return on equity. I mean, that applies mainly to banking. Excessive executive pay applies across the whole corporate sector. So I just wonder if anyone here has got any views on that, and particularly anyone who thinks that David Cameron's suggestions are going to address the problems, which I don't think they will.
I think one of the key problems with our system is the separation of ownership, control and risk. And one of the problems we have is that because of limited liability in particular, companies are able to grow enormously large and have multiple, really often quite small shareholders, as I know you know very well, and those shareholders are then relatively powerless. And in an owner-managed capitalism, where people create value for others, and their profit then, if they're creating value for others, their profit is a measure of the value they've created for those other people in their estimation, then suddenly profit and the amount that an owner takes from their business is just and moral. And I think that's the case for small businesses. And I think there is this particular problem with managerial capitalism. And I think you're right to raise this issue of market rates creeping up. I think, of course, it's going to be complicated by people competing for those roles, tending to drive prices down. Yeah, I think you raise a very important issue. I think the underlying institutions of managerial capitalism are really at the heart of the point you're making.
I think in 1965, the average pay of chief execs was something like 24 times the average wage of the population at large. That was in 1965. In 2010, the average wage of chief execs compared to the average wage has gone up to a factor of 325. So it's gone from 24 times to 325 times the average wage.
The need to transform the economy in terms of its relation to the planet, and this obviously hugely implicates the well-being of billions of people on the other side of the world, that presents a very fundamental challenge to the very idea of a free market.
Now, we keep calling this a free system and a capitalist system, but it's misleading. It's not a free system, it's a very broken one. I think if we had a free system and we priced resources well, I think we could get into the right balance with nature, which of course any of us with any sense should think that we ought to live in balance with the world around us.
I'm going to just read one paragraph from his last chapter, which is on what we can do about it, right? The fourth big change necessary is to confront the British spider's web. The most important and most aggressive single element in the global offshore system. The City of London Corporation, this offshore island floating partly free from Britain's people and its democratic system, must be abolished and submerged into a unified and fully democratic London. Britain is too subservient to the city and its offshore sector to be able to do this alone. Pressure from outside is essential. The proposal's awful sounded name, which Peter has referred to, combining reporting with formula apportionment and unitary taxation, difficult to understand, isn't it? Masks a simple, powerful and straightforward approach to tax, which several United States already use successfully. Several US states already use successfully. It is a way of taxing corporations based on the substance of what they do in the real world, rather than on the gymnastic legal fictions its accountants have cooked up.
I was just wondering, in terms of Cobden Partners, in concern with RBS, are you looking at any other private organisations that also have massive gaping holes in their bank accounts?
We mention RBS a lot in our literature simply because, although I don't believe by any means RBS is unique, it's the one bank for which we have dispositive, conclusive proof that the 2010 bonuses were paid out of losses, because it's the only bank, after the exit of Lloyds therefrom, whose most toxic assets are guaranteed by the UK taxpayer in an insurance fund called the Asset Protection Scheme, which, under the purview of HM Treasury, reported to Parliament in July 2010, stating that the 280 billion toxic book, as it then was, had expected losses totalling 57 billion. 6 months later, by December 31st, in RBS's own accounts, they had taken in losses of only 32 billion, claiming that under IFRS, expected future losses do not have to be taken through the profit and loss account. Well, let's put this in layman's parlance. Let's compare this to a man off one of these very tall citadels nearby committing suicide. Imagine if you decided to jump off that tall building across the road. When would you be economically dead as a loan under IFRS? Well, under IFRS, it's frankly when you splat on the pavement. But of course, under UK company law, which is absolutely the test that must be applied for dividends and distributions of profit-related bonuses, you're economically dead the moment you jump off that top floor. So that sort of 5 or 10 seconds it would take you to land on the pavement, in RBS terms, is a period of about 5 or 7 years between the date of the accounts in 2010 and when these losses are bound to come through, according to HM Treasury. It is absolutely unacceptable for simple black and white law in Companies Act 2006 sections 8 through 6 and 8 through 7 not to be enforced by the stewards in this building behind us of the FSA and the various other limbs of the state, such as the Treasury. So that's the reason we focus on RBS. We're not focusing specifically on private sector companies. Thank you.